Welcome to another episode of Mike's Money Picks. Today on the podcast, we're going to be breaking down the Sunday, March 31st slate of college basketball DFS. It is the second day of Elite Eight action for the 2024 NCAA Tournament. So by the time this slate is over, we will have a Final Four. And hopefully, we'll have some more money in our bank accounts because here in this slate, we're going to break down both games for the Sunday DFS slate for the Elite Eight. We're going to tell you what you can expect from each game, as well as who and how you should be building your DFS lineups with for this Sunday slate, with it being a two-game only slate. We've got a unique situation where both of these two games are rematches of games that we've seen earlier in the season. So we're going to try to figure out how we can kind of marry what happened in the previous meetings with the general X's and O's of these coaching staffs with what has happened so far in the NCAA tournament, and see if we can't figure out a way to, along with understanding DFS game theory and ownership, put together a lineup that is going to win for this Sunday slate. We're going to break that all down here for you on this episode. Now, while you are here, make sure you subscribe to the channel so that way you can be with us for the rest of college basketball season, because we will have episodes for the NIT semifinal slate that's coming up this week, as well as for the Final Four slate next Saturday, and then the national championship slate that is next Monday. So make sure you're subscribed so you can be here for all of those, and you'll know when all those episodes drop. Now, if you're watching on YouTube, I'll go ahead and address the elephant in the room. I don't know if it looks as bad on camera as it does in person, but yes, I got a little sunburn today. So believe it or not, this is actually something that happens to me every single year, because I've mentioned here on the show before, I live in North Carolina. So when I go play golf in the winter in North Carolina, no sunburn is needed because it's either not that hot out, it's not sunny out, the sun's not that bright, that powerful. And so during the winter, it's just something that doesn't become a part of your routine is putting sunscreen on. And then by the time summer rolls around, you're doing it, before you go play a round of golf every single round, right? And so today, my brain still thought it was winter. I didn't put sunscreen on and I got roasted, and it's pretty bad. It feels pretty bad. Yeah. So if you're wondering why, I look that way on YouTube, yes, that is why. It's sunburn. Sun was quite hot today. Unlike my putter, I couldn't make a putt outside of 10 feet today. But that's another story for another time. So with that being said, let's go ahead and dive into this Sunday DFS slate, kicking things off with the action between Purdue and Tennessee. All right, so in this first game, we've got a very interesting matchup, in my opinion, between Tennessee and Purdue. I believe in the intro, I might have said Gonzaga and Tennessee. That was totally a typo because Purdue beat the brakes off of Gonzaga the other night. So in this game, it is projected to be 76-73, according to KenPom, for a 149-point total, which is actually the higher game total of these two games by 2 points. It is a rematch of a game that was played earlier this season, believe it or not, in Maui at the Maui Invitational. And that game was won by Purdue 71-67. So there was 138 points scored in that game. In my opinion, this game has both the higher floor and the higher ceiling in terms of points being scored. I think this would be the game that I would be more likely to stack between these two games. Now, in that first meeting between these two teams, 71-67 Purdue, like I said, Dalton Knecht had 16 points and Jordan Gainey had 15 points for Tennessee. Nobody else from that Tennessee team was in double figures. Interestingly enough, Tennessee kind of decided to leave their bigs on an island against Zach Edey, and both Jonas Adu and Tobe Awaka fouled out in 13 minutes played in that game. So neither of them were really that big of a factor. On the Purdue side, Zach Edey did his thing. He had 23 and 10, but Fletcher Loyer was actually their leading scorer. He had 27 points and 6 boards. We talked about Fletcher Loyer all season long. He has these random ceiling games, and that first game against Tennessee was one of those ceiling games. Now, let's talk about the things from the Tennessee side from this game perspective, though. So like every game with Tennessee, everything kind of revolves around Dalton Knecht, right? He is their best offensive player. He is their usage rate leader. He is their leading scorer. He is probably, for my money, the second best player in college basketball behind Zach Edey. That's just my personal opinion. All right. And so in that game against Creighton, a game that saw 157 total points scored, ended up being a pretty good game environment. Dalton Knecht went 8 for 21 from the field, 46 fantasy points on a 32% usage rate. That is not shocking. He has these games where he really has high usage rates. Like we talked about all season long, there's a lot of games where Tennessee's offense is just, here, Dalton, make something happen, go for it. And so, he can do that, and he can have games where he takes a ton of shots. For that reason, I think his ceiling is incredibly high here on this slate. I think that at $8,300, he is the second price player, but I think you can make the argument that he's a little bit underpriced. I would probably still be willing to pay $9K for him. And so he's definitely a guy that's going to be making my lineups, and he's definitely a guy that I'm going to be using to attack this Tennessee side. Also, in that game against Creighton, Zakai Ziegler had himself a nice little night. Only 6 for 14 from the field, but put up 18, 4, and 6 for 33 total fantasy points on a 22% usage rate. Now, that usage rate's a little bit higher for Zakai Ziegler. So the reason why it might have been a little bit higher is because they were playing without Santiago Vescovi. He had the flu, and apparently he had to watch that game from like a training room inside the Dallas Mavericks arena, and like that just sounds miserable. Like, go back to the hotel. Like do something. Like, that's not a way to spend your life, right? So anyway, he's apparently going to be better for this game. Is apparently going to be active. But how many minutes is he going to be able to play if he is legitimately coming off of the flu? And so what you saw in the first game is Jemai Meshack entered the starting lineup, and he was okay, played 25 minutes, dealt with a little bit of foul trouble, put up 24 fantasy points. That absolutely would have paid off his salary on the Friday slate. And then Jordan Gainey, he played 15 minutes as well, put up 11 fantasy points. Both of those guys, I think, are going to play double-digit minutes here in this game. It's hard to imagine Vescovi playing north of 25 minutes when he's dealing with this flu conditions, right? So that's probably going to have him out of my player pool for that reason also. And I do think you can go back to Meshack or Gainey as value options. Josiah Jordan-James also had a solid game against Creighton, 37 minutes, 28 fantasy points on only 10% usage. That's what I think is a good sign for Jordan James. The fact that he didn't need a ton of shot attempts, didn't need a ton of usage to have an actual good fantasy performance, of which he hasn't really had in a while. That gives me a little bit more confidence that he can hit 4 or 5x value heading into this game. But what's really interesting is we got to talk about these two bigs, Adu and Owaka. So Adu dealt with foul trouble against Creighton as well. Actually, he didn't deal with foul trouble. He just didn't play a whole lot. I assumed when looking at his minute total that he dealt with foul trouble, but he apparently did not. He only fouled once against Creighton, but he only played 17 minutes in that game. And so, with the fact that he fouled out against Purdue in 13 minutes the first time those two teams played, this just doesn't really point to it being a good sign for Jonas Adu playing a lot of minutes. Now, against Creighton, Tobe Owaka did play more minutes. He played 21 minutes. Like I said, I assumed it was because Adu was in foul trouble. It was not. So Owaka played 21 minutes and put up 11 fantasy points. But over the course of this season, Owaka has been more than a fantasy point per minute player. So I would be inclined to think that if Owaka plays north of 20 minutes again, he's very easily going to be able to put up north of 20 fantasy points. He has a really high usage rate when he's on the floor. He's just generally not on the floor a whole lot. But I think it's kind of, what's the right word I'm looking for here? I think the aberration in that game against Creighton isn't the fact that he played 21 minutes. I think it's the fact that he only put up 11 fantasy points, because more often than not, he puts up more fantasy points than minutes played. Now, when stacking this Tennessee side, like we mentioned, I think this game is great to stack, right? We've talked about all season long how you either want to play Dalton Connect or you want to play multiple other guys, right? Well, with it being only a 2-game slate, even if you play Connect, you're probably going to want to play somebody else with him. And so I'm kind of going to be undoing that rule. I think that you can use some of these other guys with Connect. I think if I were to build a lineup around Connect, I really like the fact that Josiah Jordan-James ended up with 28 fantasy points Friday night. So I think he might make for a pretty good stacking partner with Connect, just because he doesn't require a lot of usage, doesn't require a lot of shots to return value, and he's a little bit cheaper than the likes of Ziegler and Adu. So if I'm playing Connect, I think I might go with a Connect James stack, or maybe even a Connect Meshack stack, especially if we get news that Vescovi is going to not play or not going to be 100%. Now, on the Purdue side, so Zach Edey did his thing against Gonzaga, 46 fantasy points. That's what Zach Edey does, right? And so no shock there, 27 and 14, 10 for 15 from the field, led them in usage, led them in shot attempts. That's what he does. So $11K is the price for Zach Edey, and I kind of think that he could have himself a nice little game. Ryan Kalkbrenner and Dylan Sioux were not bad against Tennessee in the last 2 games that they've played. Edey against Tennessee the first time they played, we already mentioned he was able to put up 23 and 10, and that was with not playing a super big minute total because of the fact that it was the Maui Invitational and they were playing on back-to-back days. So I really do like Edey at 11K. I don't think that is too much to pay. However, if you're looking to play both sides of this game, Edey and Connect is really going to put a lot of strain on the rest of your lineup if that's how you decide to start it, and you're probably going to be looking at just value plays from there on out. Now, after Edie, though, Braden Smith finally bounced back against Gonzaga. And we kind of mentioned on the show for Friday how we liked that spot for him, right? Like it was a pace-up game. He's a guy who requires peripheral stats to get home. Well, guess what? Tennessee is another pace-up game. Tennessee is a better defensive team than Gonzaga by quite a wide margin, but the possessions are going to get there in this game. So if there's more possessions, that's going to give more opportunities for Braden Smith to put up a lot of fancy points. Now, Lance Jones, Fletcher Lawyer, Trey Kaufman-Renn, they were all just kind of meh. Like Kaufman-Renn was like especially bad. He only played 15 minutes, only put up 6 fantasy points against Gonzaga. But we've talked about all season long how the idiots, shall you call it, like those guys that are the supporting cast of these teams, they're this team, they have random ceiling games out of nowhere, and you can never really know when it's coming or when it's not coming. And against Tennessee, the first time it was Fletcher Lawyer who had that ceiling game. So it might be worth it if you're playing enough lineups to go after a Jones or a Lawyer or a Kaufman-Renn just to see if they do happen to have one of the bigger games. In terms of bench options for this team, Gillis and Heidi and Colvin are all likely to play minutes, but not probably significant enough to do a whole lot. Gillis against Gonzaga played a total of 27 minutes, but he only put up 14 fantasy points. If you think that the minute total continues for Gillis, then he might be worth a look. But that's something that they really hadn't been doing in postseason play. It had been Kaufman-Renn playing more minutes than Gillis. So I kind of find that to be a little bit odd that against Gonzaga, Gillis was able to, in fact, play more minutes. So if I'm looking to stack up this Purdue side, like I think you can go with just Edie. I think you can go with just Braden Smith. I think you can go Edie and one of the Ediettes. I think you can go Smith and one of the Ediettes. Like I think that there's ways to kind of attack this game from multiple angles, and I really think that it's going to be. This game is probably going to determine who ends up winning GPPs, in my opinion, because is it going to be E that gets there? Is it going to be Smith that gets there? Is it going to be Connect that gets there? Or which one of the value plays are going to get there, right? Like, to me, this game has probably the widest range of outcomes. And so I'm going to be super interested to see just how this game plays out. I don't think Tennessee is going to play with the same strategy that they played the first time that they met this season. And I don't think that they're just going to let their bigs live on an island with Edie and just let them foul out in 13 minutes. That's just not a winning strategy. So it's going to be interesting to see what Rick Barnes does to adjust. It's going to be interesting to see if they do end up doubling the post, if they do end up trying to deny Edie or get the ball out of his hands, can the guards for Purdue knock down enough shots to make Tennessee pay for it? That's to be determined. But like I said, this game has a super wide range of outcomes, and I think that much like a showdown slate, if you're building a lineup around this game, build it with a narrative in mind. And so if you're playing Edie, who else for Purdue might go off if Edie's having a good game? Who else for Tennessee might go off or might be in trouble if Edie's having a good game? Or if you're fading Edie, like say you're playing Braden Smith, who else would be going off or not going off if Braden Smith is going off? So that's just one angle that I think you can attack this one. But like I said, there's a ton of different ways to attack this game because you've got the variability of what's Tennessee going to do defensively. You've got the variability of, 3-point shooting on both sides. This game, could get a high total. There's just a lot that could go on. So it's super interesting to play for it, in my opinion. All right, so let's go ahead and take a quick little breather, and then we are going to break down game number 2, one that is particularly important in the state of North Carolina, NC State taking on Duke. All right, so before we continue with game number 2, I do want to mention there are a few places where you can get more information from me. First off, you can follow me on Twitter at Mike's Money Picks. I tweet out all updates for the show on there, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you might have with DFS lineups or anything like that if you just reach out to me. Second, you can also join the Fantasy Corner Discord. The link is in the description on YouTube as well as on the audio feed. I cannot recommend that enough, y'all. The Fantasy Corner Discord is a great community of a lot of really smart, really good people who play DFS for a lot of different sports, and they're just constant bouncing ideas off each other, discussion on lineup, strategy, and just a whole lot goes into it pregame. And then, while the games happen, it's sweating it out together, talking about the games and having fun and chopping it up in there. And I cannot recommend it enough if you're looking for more people to talk DFS with. If you're sitting there thinking, well, Mike, college basketball season's over in a week. Why would I want to join now? Well, we're not just a college basketball Discord. We've got college basketball, MLB just started, NBA is still going on, and then golf is still going on as well. And then before you know it, college football and NFL are going to be back also. So I cannot recommend that enough if you're just looking for a community to be a part of and talk some DFS with, or just bounce some ideas off of some people who are very smart and have won a lot of money at this, because quite frankly, our college basketball chat has had a lot of big winners this season. If you look at the leaderboard of a lot of the big events, you see a lot of guys that are in our Discord near the top on a nightly basis. All right, so lastly, you can, if you want to know who actually makes my lineups, head on over to the Patreon, patreon.com/Mike'sMoneyPicks. What I do on Patreon is I write an article for every college basketball DFS slate where I profile my core plays as well as how I am building and attacking for each slate. And there's not a whole lot of people out there doing this for college basketball, so I do think there's a lot of information that you can get for that. If you're sitting there thinking, well, Mike, college basketball is only another week. Why would I want to pay for it now? Well, first off, it's only $3 a month, and that goes to directly supporting what we do here and paying for a lot of data sites and stuff like that. That just is our overhead cost, so it really does show a lot of support in that. But also, we're going to have content for other sports. We do the golf article every single week. We will have best ball content for NFL. We're going to have preseason fantasy draft content for NFL. And so don't think that just because college basketball season is ending that the content is going to stop over there as well. All right, so now let's go ahead and dive into game number 2. Like I said, this one is a super big deal in the state of North Carolina where I'm at because I know a lot of NC State fans. I know a lot of Duke fans. And what's interesting is the mindset on this game is different from each fan base, right? Like the NC State fans are just really excited to be here, really excited to watch their team play another round. And the Duke fans are just kind of like this is just what they do. Like it happens every year and they're just ready to be in the Final Four again. And like, I got to say, it's kind of like the most Duke thing ever to end up with a path to the Final Four that looks anything but lethal. Like they played a 13 seed in Vermont that arguably could have been a 15 seed. They played a 12 seed in James Madison. It was pretty dangerous, but just didn't shoot the ball well when they played Duke. And then they played Houston without their best player and most important player in Jamal Shead. So all the computer metrics are telling me that I should be impressed with Duke, especially considering the fact that they blew out James Madison in Vermont. You know, they rank 5th in KenPom now. But the eye test is just, I don't know, I haven't been impressed with Duke yet. And so now they get double-digit seed NC State, who beat them in the ACC tournament. And so I don't know if that's even going to impress me either. But basically, like this is a big game. And so you're either going to have one ACC team making it to the Final Four pretty much, no matter who wins this game. And you're either going to have a colossal disappointment for Duke or the continuing of a Cinderella magical run for NC State. Now, these two teams have played twice this season already. Duke won the first meeting 79-64. That is a 143-point total. NC State won the second meeting 74-69. That is also a 143-point total. KenPom has this game projected to be Duke 78-69. That is a 147-point total. Now, I don't know if any of you guys out there are conspiracy theorists. I would tend to believe that from the people I watch or the numbers that I have watched these videos and listened to these podcasts that a few of you are. So a few of you might have heard about the overinflated ball conspiracy and how the Dallas Regional, which is where this is being played, had a super inflated ball and it made shooting the ball really tough. It made ball handling really tough. And you saw really low scoring games on Friday night because the ball was too inflated. And that led partially to Marquette's poor shooting night. It led to some sloppy turnovers by all teams. And so if you believe in that conspiracy theory, then you definitely think this game is going to hit the under, and you're probably going to want to stack game number 1. But I just wanted to get that out there that is something that's floating around. Look it up on the internet if you are fascinated to learn more about that. But it's something that I saw making the rounds on Twitter today. They also talked about on there the Charlotte Regional being one of those. And as somebody who attended the Charlotte Regional on Thursday, I can say that was some very sloppy basketball, and it did look like the ball was bouncing quite a bit. Also, if you watched the episode for Tuesday, did not get to attend the Charlotte Regional on Saturday, shout out to StubHub for not making that happen. Anyway, let's go ahead and talk about what happened in the first 2 meetings between these two teams. So in the first meeting, the one that Duke won 79-64, DJ Burns had 39 fantasy points and Mohamed Diarra had 27. Those were the only 2 NC State players who neared 4x value. Duke in that game had Jeremy Roach lead in usage, and he had 33 fantasy points, which Jared McCain adding on 28. Both Kyle Filipowski and Mark Mitchell dealt with foul trouble in that game, and they had 18 and 14 fantasy points respectively. In the second meeting, NC State had Mohamed Diarra with an easy double-double. He had 52 fantasy points. DJ Burns had 22. Nobody else from State really was close to hitting value. And then for Duke, Kyle Filipowski had 54 fantasy points. Mark Mitchell had 34, and Tyrese Proctor had 27. So those were the main keys for both of these games that these two teams had played. Now, from a strategy perspective, let's talk about why that happened. So in the first meeting between these two teams, the one where DJ Burns went off, he was able to play 31 minutes in that game, had the wrong game there, 31 minutes in that game, which was above the norm. But the reason why it was happening was because Duke just refused to double in the post, and they kind of just let DJ Burns go to work one-on-one against Kyle Filipowski. and then against Ryan Young and Sean Stewart, as well as Mark Mitchell occasionally, but they were not going to double DJ Burns. They were going to let him do his work, and it ended with DJ Burns ending 12 for 19 from the field, and nobody else from NC State really got going offensively in that game. In the second game, they did not they kind of employed the same strategy. DJ Burns only played 25 minutes, still got 11 shots. But what they did was Kyle Filipowski made a point to stay out of foul trouble and stay on the floor. And he relentlessly attacked DJ Burns on the offensive end, which led to him having 54 fantasy points. And they also tried to put Burns on Mark Mitchell, and that led to him having 34 fantasy points. So basically, what ended up happening in both these games was DJ Burns played a lot of minutes because Duke was willing to let him go to work one-on-one in the post, not send the double, not send the trap, not try to get the ball out of his hands, and let him do his thing individually and not let anybody else get going offensively. Now, if you're sitting there wondering, well, Mike, Mohamed Diarra had those great fantasy performances, so you're telling me he didn't get going offensively? Not really, because Mohamed Diarra isn't like some elite scorer. He's a guy who gets a ton of fantasy points off of rebounds and other peripheral stats. So in the second game against Duke, he had 14 and 16 and then filled the stat sheet up in a variety of ways other than that to end up at 52 fantasy points. So definitely interesting to see how those two games unfolded. No guards for NC State were really that big of a factor in either game. Now, from the state perspective, how have they changed things in the NCAA tournament? Well, Mohamed Diarra is still doing his thing. He is a genuinely good play in DFS now, even at $7,400. And the reason why is because in 4 straight games, he's put up over 36 fantasy points, and he hasn't needed a big usage rate or a big number of shot attempts to do it in any of them. He's gotten a double-double in all 4 games, and he's just such a good rebounder, and he'll block you some shots. Occasionally, he'll get you some assists, that he is able to do this without much of a usage rate. And so against Marquette, he had 36 fantasy points on a 12% usage rate. That is astoundingly low. It means that he has a very wide pathway to hitting value in DFS because he's not going to need a ton of shots to hit value. And so what would happen if he actually did get a ton of shots? He'd probably end up with north of 50 fantasy points, which, by the way, he did against Duke the last time they played. So I think that Mohamed Diarra is genuinely a good play here on this slate. DJ Horne is NC State's best overall offensive player, in my opinion, and he showed it against Marquette. He only played 29 minutes, but he was 6 for 15 from the field, had 29 fantasy points in those 29 minutes on a 32% usage rate. He is the guy who, aside from DJ Burns, is going to be the guy that they run their offense through. And so I do think he has a ton of upside for that reason. The usage rates on DJ Horne give him a ton of upside. And if he can stay out of foul trouble, because against Marquette, he did have a little bit of first half foul trouble and play north of 30 minutes, which he usually does, that gives him a ton of upside. And now he has not hit value against Duke in either of the 2 times that these 2 teams played, but that doesn't really concern me because now the usage rate is just really, really good for DJ Horne. DJ Burns, one of my favorite players. I'm going to miss him. We talked about how Duke kind of let him do his thing down low in both games. And if they decide to do that again, he's probably going to have another big game against him again. So I'm definitely a guy that has to make your player pool. Probably not a guy I would go 100% on because he does have a very wide range of outcomes. And what might end up happening is even if he has a lot of success offensively, State might decide that he's not helping them by being on the floor because of what he's giving up defensively. He is a little bit of a defensive liability. But if you can kind of hide him on the 5th best offensive player, then you can really get away with it. And so they really put him on Iguodaro and Joplin in that game against Marquette, and they didn't really go to either of those 2 guys a whole lot in that game against Marquette. So that was why Burns was able to stay on the floor and still play north of 25 minutes. Now, Michael O'Connell is a guy that I like a lot. Took 10 shots in the game against Marquette, only put up 16 fantasy points, but he does get you a good amount of peripheral stats, and he plays a ton of minutes. He's played north of 30 minutes in every postseason game NC State has played so far, and that 30 was a blowout against Syracuse. He's played 35 in every game after that. So I definitely like the fact that you're getting a guy at $5,700 who's going to be on the floor for pretty much the entire game, and if this game does get going up and down, can give you a ton of stats. Casey Morsell is kind of in a similar boat. He's had 12 shots in back-to-back games, but he doesn't really do a whole lot else outside of score, and he doesn't really have a whole lot of ceiling games from a scoring perspective. So I think it would kind of take an outlier game for Casey Morsell. Between the 2 of them, I would probably rather play Michael O'Connell, but those 2 guys are going to be on the floor pretty much all the time. Ben Middlebrooks is the DJ Burns fade. In games where Burns is in foul trouble or where Burns can't hang defensively, that is when Middlebrooks plays a ton of minutes. And so if you think that Duke is going to really pound NC State down low when Burns is in, and you think that Filipowski and Mitchell are going to have their way against Burns, then Middlebrooks would be a guy that you could play because he will be coming in after that to kind of help shore up the defense because he is a better defender than DJ Burns. After that, the only other guy that really plays off the bench is Jaden Taylor. He's a boom or bust guard off the bench who has a high usage rate, but you can't really guarantee the usage or the fact that the shots go in or the minute load for that matter either. So very wide range of outcomes, bench option Jaden Taylor. All right, now for Duke, we got to talk about that game against Houston. So in that game against Houston, Kyle Filipowski and Jeremy Roach were the only two guys who were above 20% usage in that game. Filipowski turned it into 30 fantasy points. Jeremy Roach turned it into 20 fantasy points. So nobody had a really good game from a value perspective against Houston. Ryan Young might have been one of the better values. He played 23 minutes and had 11 fantasy points at a $3,300 salary. So really that game against Houston where there was 110 points scored, I believe was the total, just a not great environment from a fantasy perspective. This is going to be a much better one. So with Filipowski, we know about the massive ceiling because he's done it against State before. He's been super consistent in the last 5 or so games with having a floor of 30 fantasy points. I think he's a great cash game option. And I think that as long as he stays out of foul trouble, he has a legitimate 50 fantasy point ceiling here in this game. Now, Jared McCain, Tyrese Proctor, and Jeremy Roach, we've talked about time and time again. They're all three good players. They can all three generate offense on their own. You don't really know who's going to have a whole lot of usage, who's going to put up a whole lot of fantasy points. Like in the last game, Jeremy Roach had a 28% usage rate, but Tyrese Proctor actually outscored him from fantasy perspective. Tyrese Proctor had 22 fantasy points. Jeremy Roach had 20. If you're looking back to previous games against NC State, Jeremy Roach was more boom bust. He had 33 in the meeting at NC State and then 12 in the meeting in the NCAA tournament, whereas Jared McCain had 19 and 28 in those two games. And then Tyrese Proctor had 27 and 22 in those two games. So regardless, you're not seeing a big amount of fantasy scoring from the guards in these games. And so maybe would I recommend playing one of them and hoping that they go off? Yeah. Do I have any leans on who it is? Probably Jeremy Roach if you're a usage rate truther, but if you're more of a peripheral stats guy, McCain or Proctor are certainly more likely to come through in that regard. As we talked about earlier, Mark Mitchell would be a guy that, if NC State decides to hang with DJ Burns on the floor and they try to hide him defensively against Mark Mitchell, that's a situation where, Mark Mitchell could have a really good game. You look at the game against NC State in the ACC tournament. He was 8 for 13 from the field, which is the most shots he's taken in the game since the game against Wake Forest back in mid-February. So in that game, he put up 34 fantasy points. So I would say that's probably the ceiling for Mark Mitchell here in this one, which will be over 5x value. Definitely would have no problem playing Mark Mitchell if you're going with that strategy. Much like with the Tennessee-Purdue game, build this game around the narrative, and to me, the narrative revolves around DJ Burns. If you think Burns is able to play a lot of minutes, then he's probably a pretty viable play, and it probably makes the Duke bigs more viable plays as well. If you think Burns doesn't play a lot of minutes, then I still think you could go with one of the Duke bigs because there's probably a reason why they took DJ Burns out. But also, I think that that would bring in Ben Middlebrooks as an option on NC State. If you think that one of the Duke bigs, Filipowski or Mitchell, gets in foul trouble guarding DJ Burns, then Ryan Young would be the natural guy to go with. He played 23 minutes against Houston as a backup. And then also Sean Stewart had a really big game against NC State the first time they played, had 26 minutes off the bench and turned it into 29 fantasy points. But he is not playing much at all. He only played 3 minutes against Houston. They seem content to go to Young over Stewart. And then Jalen Blakes will probably play a little bit to spell the guards as well. But he would be a pure punt play. If I were to punt play anybody on this slate, it would probably be Ryan Young because they've shown that they will play him for either Mitchell or Filipowski off the bench. And if either of them get in foul trouble, he's probably the first guy going to the front of the line. All right, so that does it for the Sunday, March 31st slate of college basketball DFS for the Elite Eight. After Sunday, we are going to have a Final Four, and that is exciting. So if you like what you saw here in this video, please hit the like button on YouTube. If you're listening on audio, please rate and review the podcast. It helps me out a ton, and I really do appreciate it. Now, also, if you're not already, please subscribe to the YouTube channels. Please subscribe to the audio feed. It really does help me out a ton when you guys do that. Our goal is to hit 500 subscribers before the end of the NCAA tournament, and time is running out on that. And it can only happen if people like you who are watching this hit that subscribe button. It's free, it shows me a ton of support, and I really cannot say how much I appreciate it, y'all. Now, that does it for this slate, y'all. So hopefully I was able to give you guys plenty of knowledge, plenty of information that will help you build some winning DFS lineups here for this Sunday slate. That does it for the Sunday slate. But like I said earlier, we're going to be back for the NIT slate. We're going to be back for the Final Four slate. We're going to be back for the Showdown National Championship slate. So make sure you're subscribed so that way you will know when those episodes drop. And also, college basketball season is coming to a close, so make sure you give some other sports a shot. We're still going to have weekly golf content, and then as we head into the college basketball offseason, we are going to have a lot of preseason NFL fantasy football content, as well as college fantasy football and college football DFS content coming your way. So make sure you are here for that as well. All right, so that does it for this episode, guys. So thank you guys for watching and listening to this point. Hopefully, we're going to be able to have ourselves a profitable DFS slate here on Sunday. Best of luck to you guys in DFS, in brackets, survivor pools, whatever action you got on these college basketball games. Best of luck to you. Thank you guys for watching and listening.